Yeah, you have 5 minutes left. Still around.
The Hutchinson building, Scott Boston matinees went, okay, this is the place. I went came here.
So I got a Britta Waldschmidt and then
I was going to do some light on upstairs.
still around.
What was that?
Yeah.
Exactly.
And are you in the air?
No, in history.
Same as last one.
So, yeah.
Like going over like, is this your
Good
job?
Yeah, that's right.
This one, so I'm just like that. Neil Salisbury retired.
Oh, really?
High five people.
Yeah, you would be wrong.
And then in American history, that's about it. There's 2 people teaching American history. So, and then there's other historians.
And of course, there's
Yes, yeah.
you know, there's Christian Yusha.
She's a recent hire.
Which I thought about this morning.
And
To take care of that.
she does like material culture and American history. She's quite big. You're again now too.
So if
That's she's younger. So
if I were to give you a name of Paul,
it's on the America's like website. I haven't met him though.
it's a different, no, if they live 3 minutes from here.
Okay.
Yeah, they live both in time.
Yeah.
But he did all the reasons. So
Oh, cool. That's nice.
she did a, was on how Paul speaking was.
That sounds like
Give it an eye.
that sounds like a good topic.
You're making, you're making this deal perfectly. Because
You got
I
asked.
would know, yeah, I know, right? But.
Also, boy to know.
Yeah.
And where are you?
Brenda. So, that gig,
Ran into each other somewhere, I feel like.
you know, I wondered about that. We would have,
Maybe you can go.
we would have
So I'll introduce you.
Yeah.
And then you come. So you're welcome.
Oh my God, we just talked about it. And I wanted to surprise Britta because she was my secondary. I haven't seen her in a few years. For a last
I'd be happy to. In there too, just to get an idea of what they look like. Oh, I'd be happy to. We'll just take we'll get your address through the Hutchins Center and put you on our list. That would be great.
We'll talk about it.
Oh, you can send it. We have electronic too, but I'm happy to send it to you. And my other one was just the textbooks if you want. I'm not sure what he's doing right now, but he emailed me. Okay, I think we're going to get started. Oh, God. Okay, that was loud. Okay, I don't have to yell. Hi, everyone. I'm Abby Wolf. I'm the executive director here at the Hutchins Center, and it's a pleasure to see you here and to see some people I haven't seen in several years, so on this side of the room. But let me just begin by saying I don't think the Hip Hop Archive staff is in here right now, but I always like to thank them for letting us use this wonderful space. We're delighted to, I'll get started now. We're delighted to welcome Britta Waldschmidt Nelson to the Hutchins Center today to speak on the topic From Swastika to Jim Crow, German Jewish Refugees in the Southern United States, 1938 to 65. Dr. Waldschmidt Nelson is a longtime affiliate of the Hutchins Center, going back to the days of the Du Bois Institute, and she's presented to us on at least 2 different occasions that I can remember, possibly before that. I don't know, 2005 and 9, I think. But this talk today marks the first collaboration of what we hope will be many between the Hutchins Center and Harvard Center for Jewish Studies, which is supporting Dr. Waldschmidt Nelson's talk today through its Joseph Engel Fund. Rachel Rockenmacher and Rachel is in the front row, and we've been scheming for quite some time about how to get our 2 centers together. And when Britta wrote to me and asked me about this topic she's working on, and might there be an opportunity, some little light bulbs went off in my head, and I said, yes, there's opportunity with us, certainly, and I'm glad to say with the Center for Jewish Studies as well. A little about Dr. Waldschmidt Nelson. She's the professor of transatlantic history and culture at the history department of the University of Augsburg, where she has been on the faculty since 2016. Before that, she served as deputy director of the German Historical Institute here in DC for 5 years. And from 1994 to 2011, she taught American history and culture at the University of Munich, where she had also earned her master's and doctoral degrees in American culture and history. After completing her undergraduate studies in English literature, German literature, and European history, her immersion in the study of American history and literature began in earnest at the University of California, Davis. where she spent a study abroad year in 1987 and 88. She was a visiting scholar as well at the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies in Washington, D.C. In the early 90s. Dr. Waldschmidt Nelson's chief areas of research are African American studies, transatlantic relations, and gender and religious history. She's the author of From Protest to Politics, Black Women in the Civil Rights Movement and in the Congress of the United States, which was selected as Book of the Month by the Journal Anschläge in March 1999. I'm very detailed in my introductions. I'll leave some detail out. Because we want to hear from you more than from me. She co-edited the volume Europe and America, Cultures in Translation in 2006 and published a book on Christian Science in Germany in 2009. More recently, she has continued to write on Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, on the decade of the 60s and counterculture, as well as on the rise of conservatism in Western Europe and the US in the 1960s and 70s. On behalf of the directors of the Hutchins Center, Professor Henry Louis Gates, and the Center for Jewish Studies, David Stern, neither of whom can be here unfortunately today, I want to welcome Britta Waldschmidt Nelson this afternoon. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so very much, Abby, for this much too generous, wonderful introduction. And I also would like to thank everybody, Abby and Rachel and Krishna and everybody else who was involved in making it possible for me to be here tonight, this afternoon. And especially thanks for the support from the Center for Jewish Studies and the Hutchins Center. And thank you for all of you for showing up today on such a gorgeous day outside, for sacrificing some time to be in here. And I hope it will be not too boring for you. So Abby had already mentioned the title of my chair in Augsburg. The German name for this actually is of the denomination of my professorship is die Geschichte des europäisch-transatlantischen Kulturraums. So if you were to translate that literally, it's the history of the European transatlantic cultural space. And that's quite a mouthful, so I usually say just I teach transatlantic history and culture. But the idea of this denomination really is to take a closer look at how the multifaceted networks of transatlantic relations and developments have influenced people's life in the course of history in both Europe and the United States. And the topic I want to talk about today, namely the story of German Jewish refugee scholars, is an excellent example of this kind of transatlantic histoire croisée, you know, the French expression, Verflechtungsgeschichte. I don't know, Werner, is there a better word in English for histoire croisée? Entangled history? Yeah, for the entangled history. Thank you, Olga. The Augsburg faction here, helping out. So I think it's an excellent example to show this. And now I'm going to use this. My interest in this topic was actually awakened a number of years ago by a little booklet that I came across when I was working at the GHI, which was published by Gabrielle Edgecombe in 1993. And it has the title, From Swastika to Jim Crow, Refugee Scholars at Black Colleges. And in this publication, the author, who herself came to the US as a Jewish refugee in 1936, compiled various materials, including a list of names of refugee scholars who taught at these black colleges, as well as some excerpts of interviews that Edgecombe conducted with these scholars and their students in the 1980s. The book, whose surtitle, as you may have noticed, I borrowed for today's lecture, is not a scientific monograph in that sense, but rather more a kind of commentated primary source collection, which remains in many parts slightly inaccurate and incomplete. Nevertheless, Edgecombe's work is an important and impressive testimony to the experience of these German Jewish refugees, and it also inspired a TV documentary of the same name in the year 2000. However, except from this brief little book, the film, and a related photo exhibit, the importance of the presence of German Jewish scholars in the south of the United States has gained really very little attention by scholars on both sides of the Atlantic, and it's practically unknown by the larger public in both Europe and the United States to this day. And therefore, this talk aims at showing that these individuals played a very special role in the context of transatlantic relations, since their history is based on a double experience of persecution and oppression, but also of resistance and political activism. Examining 3 different case studies with you today, I would like to illustrate how these scholars, in a time of great social upheaval, try to change existing norms of behavior in different ways, and how they became advocates for human rights and racial justice, often despite grave personal risks to themselves. Before that, however, I would like to say a few words about the reasons for the presence of these scholars in America and in the United States South. And now the problem is I really don't know how familiar people here are with the situation of Jews in Germany and after the rise of National Socialism, or with the details of the Jim Crow system before the 1960s. So what I thought I'll do is I'll give you a little bit of historical context, and if you want to have more details, I'll be more than happy to get back to any specific questions at the end in our discussion. So let's first look at what happened in Germany. As most of you know, German Jews were subject to increasingly severe discrimination from Hitler and his National Socialist Party after the Nazi takeover of power in Germany in January of 1933. What had remained mainly propaganda before now turned into actual open harassment and legal persecution of Jews in the German Reich, all in accordance, of course, with the Nazis' stridently racist worldview. Hitler and his followers believed that the Germans were racially superior and that there was a struggle for survival between them and the so-called inferior races. For example, Jews and Roma, which were called gypsies back then, people of African descent, handicapped people, and all others who didn't fit their genetic racial ideals. So they actually thought that these people posed a biological threat to the purity of the so-called Aryan race, the German race, which was considered the Herrenrasse or master race. The approximately 500,000 German Jews, who back then made up less than 1% of the German population, were the principal targets of Nazi hatred. They were persecuted much earlier and harsher than any other group in Germany, including people of African descent. And if you're interested in that later, I can explain why that was. But Jews really bore the brunt of Nazi persecution. And this persecution came in different phases. The first step was the so-called Law for the Restoration of the Professional Civil Service in April of 1933, which dismissed most public officials of Jewish origins from their jobs. Then, in the following months, all those whom the Nazis defined as Jews or half-Jews were relieved of their positions as civil servants, administrators, judges, and also university professors. Books by Jewish authors, and by authors other that the Nazis considered their enemies, were thrown out of the libraries and publicly burned. And as a next step, the exclusion of Jews was extended to the private economy. Jews were fired from leading positions in stores, restaurants, and other businesses. The Nazis also called upon all good German citizens to boycott Jewish-owned businesses and avoid having social contacts with Jews. To make it easier to recognize them, Jews were eventually forced to wear a yellow Star of David made of cloth on their clothing whenever they went out. With the Nuremberg laws of 1935, the legal, social, and political and economic discrimination of Jews reached a new level. Among other things, this law deprived German Jews of all civil rights and introduced strict racial segregation laws. For example, Jews could not use public transportation anymore. They couldn't sit on regular benches that were reserved for Aryans, and they couldn't use the same swimming pools as non-Jews in Germany. Also, moreover, the Nuremberg laws strictly banned mixed marriages between Jews and the so-called Aryans. Gentile spouses of Jewish men and women were pressed to divorce their husbands or wives if they wanted to keep their jobs or their children. In the summer of 1938, Jews were legally prohibited from engaging in any independent economic activity. And then the most brutal phase of the anti-Jewish terror began, and this is actually 80 years ago today, in the so-called Reichskristallnacht. Jewish businesses were raided, storefronts destroyed, and synagogues firebombed by marauding Nazi troops dressed up as civilians in the so-called Reichskristallnacht of November of 1938. And at the same time, many Jews were arrested and put into forced labor camps. Then came the mass deportations into concentration camps, and you all know how this horrible story continued into the nightmare of the Holocaust. almost 400,000 Jews tried to escape from the German Reich in the 1930s, and many of those who succeeded with that hoped to find a new home in America, of course, the home of the free. But only about 95,000 Jewish refugees who actually managed to enter the United States, often via England, by the way. And the New World did not really welcome them as warmly as they had hoped. Even though the persecution of Jews in Germany was very well known on both sides of the Atlantic, American willingness to help the newcomers remained rather limited. This was largely due to the fact that in the 1930s, of course, the United States experienced the worst depression of its history. Millions of people were unemployed, and a lot of families were struggling to survive and to make ends meet. Many Americans therefore considered the refugees a potential competition on the labor market and were therefore against admitting them to the country. In addition, though, some also believed in anti-Semitic stereotypes, which had become increasingly popular in the United States in the wake of high levels of Jewish immigrations from Eastern Europe in the late 19th and early 20th century. So anti-Semitic groups like the Ku Klux Klan, the American Nazi Party, or the so-called German-American Bund regularly agitated against the Jewish intruders, as they call them. Their anti-Jewish propaganda reached its peak in the United States in the second half of the 1930s, denouncing Jews as fraudulent parasites, communists, and warmongers. And of course, not all Americans shared these views. However, in opinion polls that were conducted in 1938 and 1939, more than 65% of those questions were actually against admitting more Jewish refugees. And even admitting emergency transports with Jewish children, who were brought over, and the St. Louis is just one example of this, even that was unacceptable to a majority of the American people. And you can look up these opinion polls online. I mean, really, you can see the majority of the people were against admitting Jewish refugees. So despite numerous appeals from international aid organizations, the US government refused to increase its immigration quotas for Jews until the end of the Second World War, when it was basically too late for most of the Jews who perished in the concentration camps. Now, in this climate of a lot of anti-Semitism, it was, of course, not easy for those German Jews who had made it into the United States to gain a foothold in their new homeland. And especially academics often had a really hard time finding a job. Of course, if you were a Nobel Prize winner or an internationally renowned scientist, then you didn't have problems. People like Albert Einstein, Otto Stern, or Emmy Noether, people who won Nobel Prizes, were world famous, or philologists like Theodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer, or Herbert Marcuse. They were, of course, welcomed with open arms because they added, prestige to the universities who hired them. But less well-known scientists, and especially if they came from the field of the humanities, often spent many months, sometimes years, looking for a job without success. One reason for this was, by the way, and I don't want to whitewash that within many American universities of the time, especially the well-known Ivy Leagues, and including, I'm sorry to say, Harvard University, there were actually considerable levels of anti-Semitism in the 30s. And strict quotas limited the admission of Jewish students, and many universities also ensured that the number of Jewish colleagues within their teaching staff was kept to a minimum, or definitely, did not rise above a certain level. However, there was one group of universities that were very interested in hiring the German Jewish refugee scholars, and those were the historically black colleges and universities in the south of the United States, or called HBCUs. And the emergence of these colleges is, of course, inseparably connected to the racial segregation laws of the Jim Crow law, or the Jim Crow laws in the south of the United States. And so I'm assuming that most people here have some sort of idea about Jim Crow and how it came into being after the Civil War was over. And when Reconstruction ended, the Southerners wanted to, reestablish their power and keep blacks, quote unquote, in their place by putting these new laws into place. In some states like Mississippi, they even became part of the state's constitution. So as I said, if you want to, I can go into the origins of Jim Crow later. But what I want to do here is just sort of summarize a little bit what the main goals were of these Jim Crow laws. Because they were basically, you can summarize three goals that these laws had. The first was the political exclusion of the black population. Because remember, since the 15th Amendment had been passed in 1865, blacks theoretically were supposed to be able to vote. And so what the South did is they established all these extra things, whether it was poll tax, literacy test, or the infamous grandfather clause, which said in our state only people can vote whose grandfather already voted here. And these were tricks and devices used to disenfranchise pretty much over 90% of the African American population in the South. The second goal was the control over the black labor force. Because remember, I mean, people, the plantation owners, needed people to still work on their fields. So what they did is they passed laws that basically prohibited African Americans from any other occupation except in the agricultural or in the service sector. You know, so blacks can still work in the fields and the black women could clean their houses, but everything else was prohibited. And the third goal was strict racial segregation in all areas of public life, including public transportation, restaurants, movie theaters, bathrooms, drinking fountains, schools, hospitals, even telephone booths. Everything was segregated. And of course, needless to say, racial intermarriage was strictly prohibited. And for almost a whole century, these Jim Crow laws proved to be extremely effective. And especially because any attempts by the black population to rebel against them were not only punishable by law enforcement, but also by the terror of white supremacist organizations such as the Ku Klux Klan. So if you tried to act up, you or your family paid for it. White supremacists did not consider African Americans to be equal human beings, and thus they were denied full citizenship rights and treated as second-class people who had to keep proper distance from the white Herrenrasse, master race. So as you will notice, doubtlessly, that there is a big similarity between the Jim Crow laws and the Nuremberg laws. It's very obvious. And in fact, Hitler and his collaborators had partially been inspired by the Southern Jim Crow laws when they designed the Nuremberg laws and their apartheid system in Germany. In any case, one effect of this Jim Crow laws was that the segregated school system and also the fact that African Americans were generally prohibited from attending public universities in the South was of course detrimental to black access to good quality education. But some African Americans who recognized early on that education was the key in the struggle for freedom and equality started very early, already in the 1860s, to found and organize privately funded schools and colleges for black students. Sometimes they were supported by white philanthropists from the North. Julius Rosenwald is one example of them. Sometimes they organized it by themselves. But anyway, there were about over 150 of these colleges and universities founded, and over 100 of them are still in existence today. And I just listed some of the most important and oldest one here. And these institutions have really become beacon lights for black higher education in the South. However, they also had a problem because for a long time, the majority of the HBCUs primarily offered vocational training and did not focus on academic graduate studies. And until the Second World War, actually, most of the HBCUs were not accredited as universities yet, and none of them offered a PhD program until in the 1950s. In fact, the first black university to offer a PhD program was Howard University, and they didn't start until 1956 or 57. Also, most of the HBCUs had a chronic lack of funding. I mean, even though they got some funding, it was not comparable to what most white universities received. And thus, they could pay only rather low salaries to their staff. They could not offer sabbaticals to their professors, and their libraries were pretty small. So because of all of this, it was not easy for HBCUs to attract and recruit highly qualified professors for their faculties. And in this situation, the job-seeking German refugee scholars who came, from German universities who at the time, this is the 1930s, were considered by many people to be the best universities in the world, were of course a very attractive potential hiring option for the HBCUs, and that is why they were much more open than the northern universities to accept applications from these scholars. Now, some of the German Jewish refugee scholars were actually not very enthusiastic at first, when it was suggested to them that they should apply to colleges in the South, because they said, oh my God, so little money, and that's not a really accredited university. So they were reluctant. And also, it wasn't like the relationship between Jews and blacks in the United States was all that rosy and wonderful at the time. Because as you can imagine, a lot of the Jews who had come earlier to this country, already in the late 19th century, early 20th century, had adopted some of the anti-black stereotypes of the white Anglo-Saxon majority. And also, as you all know, within black nationalism, there are some very strong elements of anti-Semitism too. So I don't want to sort of paint this picture that everything was just beautiful and harmonious. It wasn't. But in the end, what was most important for those scholars who often, had families and needed to make some money, in the end, the fact that they could just get back to work and get a job was more important than all the other concerns. So in total, 50 to 60 of the refugee scholars actually moved down to the south of the United States and accepted job there at either black colleges and some others also at state universities, which is, for example, one thing that Ms. Edgecombe leaves out completely in her book. Now, the paradox of this situation was, of course, that these German Jewish refugees had fled Nazi racism and segregation in Germany. And here they're coming to the United States, the country of liberty and equality, and all of a sudden they find themselves back again in a system of racial segregation. Except the difference was now that all of a sudden they were now on the side of the privileged class, because in the South, the white Jews from Germany were considered to be white. So they were expected to sit in the front of the bus. Their kids attended German schools, and they did have access to the white swimming pools and other stuff, okay? So that was a really paradoxical situations that the Jews in the South had to deal with. And actually for them, this was a very uncomfortable situation. They didn't like it because most of them, of course, were completely opposed to racial segregation and discrimination. That's something they had suffered from in Germany. They did not want to live with that. They didn't want to expect that. But on the other hand, most of these refugees had also been deeply traumatized, by Nazi police and persecutions, by the Gestapo, which was a secret police. So one thing they did not want to do was attract the attention of the authorities. And they did not want to ever get into conflict with the police. So, of course, for them, it was hard. They wanted to not abide by Jim Crow laws, but they were terrified to not abide by the laws of the land where they were. So it was very difficult. And of the many fascinating examples that exist, I have selected 3 now that, in my view, show how in very different ways and from different perspectives these German Jewish professors acted and dealt with this specific situation and new environment. And the examples, I think, also reveal how the cultural exchange processes between the scholars, their students, and the local population not only helped to change their own destiny, but also change the society in which they lived. So now I'm getting actually to my case studies finally. Let's start with somebody from the University of Augsburg, Holger, where the two of us come from, okay? Friedrich Georg Friedmann was born in Augsburg in 1912. And actually in 1989, this was before I came to Augsburg, the University of Augsburg made him an honorary academic citizen in recognition of his merits in inspiring young people for the principles of liberal democracy and for the ideals of transcendental humanism. Now, many people in Germany, of course, know Friedrich Friedmann. They know that he was a great German philologist, an important person in American studies, and an important humanist. But hardly any Germans, and probably even fewer Americans, are aware of the fact that Friedrich Friedmann worked as a university teacher in the United States South during the 1940s and 50s, and that his life there did not remain unaffected by the conflicts of racial segregation. So let's go to Augsburg in the 1930s. Like all the other protagonists presented here, Friedmann came from a liberal bourgeois Jewish family, and he had experienced a rather happy, harmonious childhood in Bavaria. But after the shock of his arrest and interrogation by the Gestapo in the summer of 1933, the then 21-year-old Friedmann decided to move to Italy to escape further persecution by the Nazis. He studied literature and philosophy in Rome, and he married Elisabeth Oberdorfer, who also came from Augsburg, in 1938. But of course, as you know, after Hitler and Mussolini had joined forces, anti-Semitic race laws were also enacted in Italy shortly after the wedding of the Friedmans. So therefore, the newly married couple fled to England just before the outbreak of World War II. Their son, John Friedman, was born in London in 1940. A few months later, they managed to get a boat passage to Canada, and from Canada they were allowed to immigrate to the United States. Exhausted and without any financial means left, the small family finally managed to reach relatives of Elizabeth Friedman in Memphis, Tennessee. And these relatives took them in, but they didn't have the financial means to provide, for 3 extra mouths to feed. So Friedman had to get a job. And he looked around and he finally found a job at a small Methodist college in Jackson, Tennessee, where he taught philosophy and mathematics for basically free food and lodging for his family, as well as a tiny stipend of $10 a month. And so that was his first job. In 1942, the Friedman's little daughter Miriam was born, who lives in Augsburg now, by the way. I had the pleasure of interviewing her. And in order to be able to feed the growing family, Friedman changed to a better paid position as a mathematics and physics teacher at an aviation school in Kentucky in 1943. I mean, here's somebody who studied languages and philosophy and is now teaching mathematics at an aviation school. People were willing to do anything just to make a living. So when the war was over, Fritz and Elisabeth Friedman were horrified to find out that all 4 of their parents, plus many, many other relatives who had remained in Germany, had all been killed in the Holocaust. Deeply shocked and saddened, they decided to stay in America. In 1946, Friedman was appointed professor of philosophy at the State University of Arkansas in Fayetteville, a university where only whites were allowed to study, but he got a pretty good salary, and hey, he could teach philosophy again finally. So that's why the Friedman family moved to Fayetteville. Fayetteville was a small southern town with a low percentage of black residents, and it was considered a relatively liberal community. But of course, here too, as all over the South, segregation laws were in place everywhere. The children of the Friedmans attended a white school and rarely came into contact with African Americans, even though Friedrich Friedman fundamentally rejected segregation and any form of racial discrimination. He soon began to acquire a profound knowledge of African American history, and later he wrote several excellent essays on race relations and the problem of the color line in the United States. In these texts, he harshly criticized the manifestations of white supremacy from anthropological, psychological, and philosophical perspectives. But that was later, and most of these texts were published, in German, so nobody could read them in the United States. Because during his first years in Arkansas, Friedman avoided speaking publicly about the issue of race. Due to his traumatic experience in Germany, he really did not want to risk any conflicts with the authorities of Arkansas. And so he was trying to somehow take a kind of middle-of-the-road approach to deal with this whole situation. For example, what it is, in the early 1950s, he actually agreed to supervise a 35-year-old black Baptist pastor who came to him and wanted to write his master thesis on Gottfried Leibniz with him. So here's a black student. Of course, he's not supposed to deal with him because, the University of Fayetteville only admitted white students. But so what Friedman did is he said, okay, I'll counsel you. I'll, be the supervisor of your thesis, but you cannot come to my office and you cannot come to my house because that would, of course, violate segregation laws. So whenever they wanted to talk about the thesis, they met in the garden behind the house. So Friedman would meet this black young pastor and counsel him all the way through his thesis in the garden of his house where people from the street couldn't see that he actually had a black visitor. But so he tried to not, he tried to go beyond the segregation laws but not attract attention. But then something happened that moved Friedman to step beyond this careful restraint. And that was something that you all know about. In May of 1954, the NAACP achieved an important legal victory when the US Supreme Court ruled that racial segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. And you're all familiar with that story. And you also know that despite that decision of the Supreme Court, most of the school districts in the South refused to integrate their schools, and they tried to procrastinate it and made a fuss about it. So in the capital of Arkansas, Little Rock, 9 black students had actually been promised the right to attend the previously Lily White Little Rock Central High School at the instigation of the local NAACP and its president, Daisy Bates. But of course, white segregationists didn't want to allow for this to happen. And so they were willing to use any means necessary to block these kids from going to Little Rock High School. On the first day of school, a white mob brutally attacked the 9 black students, their companions, and journalists. Stones were thrown and shots fired into the house of Daisy Bates. Many black civil rights activists in Little Rock feared for their lives. They hoped, of course, for police protection, but the governor of the state, Orville Phobos, sided with the white segregationists and used the Arkansas police and actually also the state troopers not to protect the black children and their access to the school, but actually to keep the children out of this high school. And in this situation, Friedrich Friedman had enough. So he wrote a letter to the governor, sort of a semi-public letter, on September 17th, 1957. And in this letter, he asked Phobos to reconsider his position, to put a stop to white mob rule, and to respect the court ruling. And in the end of his letter, he had the following appeal, and I quote, "Your choice, as I see it, is between playing the role of a political leader with its ephemeral victories and defeats and being a man of greatness, who through his own spiritual struggles and transformation will lead millions of men towards a peaceful and constructive approach to the problem which weighs so heavily on us today." Friedman received no response to his letter, but the newspapers reported it, and some of his white neighbors were shocked at his advocacy for racial integration. So they really got some nasty comments from the neighbors. In addition, his letter infuriated white state authorities about what they considered a most impudent interference by university staff, foreign university staff, in the matter of school integration. Now, when President Eisenhower finally ended the so-called Little Rock crisis by deploying federal troops who remained in the city for a whole year to guarantee the 9 black children's access to Central High School, the segregationists were furious. And they decided to use other means that they had at their disposal to harm the NAACP and to harm all the liberal supporters of the civil rights movement. And thus what they did in 1958, the Arkansas Parliament, with the support of Governor Phobos, passed a new law, the so-called Act 10. And this act declared that all state employees, including professors at public universities, who wanted to keep their job, had to sign an affidavit listing all social, religious, and professional organizations they belonged to. You had to do that if you wanted to keep your job. The purpose of this action was, of course, to be able to identify any NAACP members and kick them out of their jobs, right? Or of any other liberal organizations that the government didn't like. Friedman himself, actually, and this is the key, he did not belong to the NAACP. He did not belong to any organization. But still, he considered Act 10 as an intolerable infringement on academic freedom and a violation of the very principles of the American Constitution, which he, as a Jewish refugee, so highly esteemed. So he thought, no, this is unacceptable. And therefore, as one of only 4 of 150 members of his faculty, only 4, and Friedman was one of them, he steadfastly refused to sign the requested affidavit. And instead, he eventually, in the end, published an official statement in July of 1959, including the following explanation of his behavior. And again, I quote, "I consider a university as a place where people, in addition to preparing themselves for a livelihood, acquire the attitudes and knowledge that alone make life humanly worthwhile. This implies freedom from any forces which, under whatever pretext, create a climate of fear and frustration and directly or indirectly inhibit the search for truth." Friedman thus remained true to his humanistic principles in the dispute over racial integration. The price for this was high, because even though he was a tenured professor, the university used the statement to fire him right away. And many white segregationists, of course, thought this served him right. But however, there were also some supportive reactions from many students and from some white neighbors, and other professors actually helped Friedman to find a new job, and just a few weeks later, he was able to accept an offer from Wells College in Aurora, New York, where he taught as professor of philosophy for 1 year. In 1960, he was surprisingly offered a chair for North American cultural history at the University of Munich. And after some hesitations, he followed the advice of his friend Hannah Arendt, who happened to be visiting, and accepted the position on a sort of trial kind of basis. He said, I'll go there for a few years and see how I like it. And so he and his wife, Friedrich Friedmann and his wife, actually returned to Bavaria in the fall of 1960, and they ended up staying there for the rest of their lives. And in the following decades, Friedmann not only became one of the most important pioneers with regard to the development of American studies in Germany, but also a major protagonist of reconciliation, cultural exchange, and positive cooperation between Jews and Christians in Germany. His experiences with racial segregation in Arkansas may not only have motivated, but also enabled him in a special way to mediate constructively between two groups whose relationship had been burdened by mutual prejudice and distrust. So that is Friedrich Friedmann. Now for my second case study, I would like to introduce Victor Löwenfeld. Any art historians here in the audience? No? Yes? Do you know him? Because he's kind of known among
I don't
in
know
art
the last-
history.
I'm sorry, what's the last name?
No, Löwenfeld or Lowenfeld in the United States.
No, I'm afraid I don't know.
Okay. Anyway, he was an artist, so I'll tell you. But it doesn't matter if you don't know him. I'll tell you who he was. Löwenfeld, whose name is, as I was, Lowenfeld in the United States, had been born in Linz, Austria in 1903, and he had served as professor of art education and director of the arts program at the School for the Blind in Vienna when the Nazis took over in the infamous Anschluss of Austria to Germany in 1938. Together with his wife Margaret and their 7-year-old son John, they fled to England and then to the United States. And I'm speeding this up a little bit here. In 1939, Löwenfeld accepted a position as professor of industrial arts at the Hampton Institute, a historical black college in Virginia. His main task here was officially to teach technical drawings skills to future craftsmen and construction engineers. So it was supposed to be all technical drawings, okay? No art, but the skills, the technical skills. And Löwenfeld did that, but he also soon began to offer additional evening courses in creative art in his spare time. You know, he just couldn't only stick to the construction drawing stuff. So in these seminars, Löwenfeld asked his African-American students to not only copy the style of European masters or create beautiful landscape paintings, but rather to trace their own experiences and let their innermost feelings run free. He encouraged them to express their emotions artistically, and regardless of whether their art would appeal to white viewers or not. As a refugee from Nazi-occupied Vienna, he knew from his own experience how difficult it can be for an oppressed people to produce creative art. As he wrote in 1945, and I'm quoting Löwenfeld here, "The Negro artist is very conscious of the restrictions enforced upon him. Our imagination is strongly influenced by freedom's presence or absence. Whenever our freedom is restricted or gone, we become like the prisoner whose only outlook is the walls of his prison. I remember very well how my whole thinking and doing became paralyzed when Hitler marched into Vienna, and the only thought I was capable of was how to get out of this hell." Löwenfeld directly compared the destructive psychological effect of segregation and the fear of racist terror to which blacks in the South were exposed with the destructive psychological effects that the Nazi terror had once held on him. He therefore felt a great need to use art now in the country that had given him refuge from the Nazis as a means of liberating the minds of his students from fear, for fostering creativity and combating prejudices and oppression. His attitudes and action indeed turned out to have a noticeable effect on his students. The internationally renowned artist John Biggers, who was supposed to be trained as a plumber in Hampton, that's what the kid was sent there for, to become a plumber. He ended up becoming an artist, and mainly because of Löwenfeld. As Biggers recalled later in an interview, he said, "When Victor offered this evening class, he instructed the class from the point of view of what he called self-expression. Here was an outlet to say something about how one truly felt about life and about the personal frustration. It was like magic." Löwenfeld also introduced his black students to works of art from Africa and their magnificent aesthetics. Until then, African art was hardly known in the South, for in American culture at that time, with the exception of the Harlem Renaissance, of course, Africa was usually portrayed as a continent of uncivilized barbarians. And in the southern state, anything black was considered culturally inferior anyway. So many of the African American students in Hampton thus actually received their first knowledge and a more positive understanding of their African heritage through Victor Löwenfeld. And in addition, it was very important to him to make everyone comprehend the importance of art as an actual tool against negative stereotypes and social injustice. As Löwenfeld student Samela Lewis later commented once, he encouraged us to use art as an instrument or a tool to combat serious deprivation and prejudice and the evils of discrimination. He forced us to take a position in relation to humanity and to inhumane treatment of other people. So that's really what they took away from the classes of Löwenfeld. And the works of art created by the Löwenfeld students, which also depicted, not just a beautiful landscape, but it actually depicted the harsh and the dark sides of African American life, of course, often violated the expectations and sort of the social norms of what's considered, quote unquote, acceptable Negro art at the time, especially in the South. And I don't know if you can see them, those are just some of the pictures. But these images did attract quite a bit of positive attention in other parts of the country. Several of his students were invited to participate in art exhibitions in the North, including the highly regarded Museum of Modern Art in New York City. Even in Virginia, Löwenfeld eventually had a little bit of recognition. In 1943, for example, he was elected president of the Board of Trustees of the Virginia Arts Alliance. And this alliance was previously only for whites, and when he was president, he moved them to finally also accept black members. Unlike white professors from the southern states, Löwenfeld also often invited his black students over to his house, just for tea or for dinner. White professors never did that. They didn't socialize with black students. And it was on one of those evenings when John Biggers was actually with him that Löwenfeld received a letter with the terrible news that all of his relatives who had remained in Europe, literally every single one of them, had died in the Nazi concentration camps. And he was very shocked, and Biggers was with him, and he later remembered this moment as follows. This was one of the most horrendous experiences I've ever had, because a human being was telling me that his family had been burned. I had heard of neighbors whose family members had been lynched, but I realized then that race and color might not have any meaning at all when it comes to terrifying experiences in this world. I always felt a relationship with Victor because he had shared this with me. I felt the relationship had truly crossed all country and racial barriers. The recognition that not only hatred and suffering, but also art and humanism can work beyond the boundaries of religion, nationality, and race really expanded the consciousness of Löwenfeld's students. And at the same time, he himself also gained new hope and courage and, just to continue to live on in the face of, having lost all of his family by working creatively together with his students. However, the management of Hampton Institute was, of course, not all enthusiastic about this integrative approach of their art professor. And the contrary, the first interracial art exhibit organized by Löwenfeld in 1944 at the Virginia Museum of Fine Art was sharply criticized. And when he presented his plans for an interracial art workshop at the Hampton Institute in 1945, the University Board of Trustees demanded his resignation. For Löwenfeld and his students, this was a bitter disappointment because it showed, that there are limits to what you can do against white supremacy and white power in the South. But they kept going, and so in 1946, Löwenfeld accepted an offer of employment from Penn State University and moved to Pennsylvania. And actually most of his students, including Biggers and Samela Lewis, followed him there. But despite of these setbacks, Löwenfeld's conviction that art can free the mind, transcend all barriers, and create new opportunities for whites and blacks to work together ultimately had a lasting positive impact. It helped to change the worldview and enhance the life of many of his students, and in the long term, it also helped to enrich the American art scene quite significantly. Victor Löwenfeld's example thus shows that the group of German Jewish university teachers shaped transatlantic exchange not only in the area of social and political interaction, but also in the area of art and culture. So, and now I'll come to my last example for today, and that is about Wilma and Georg Iggers. Wilma Iggers was born in 1921 as Wilhelmina Abeles in the then German-speaking West Bohemian region of what is now the Czech Republic. And she grew up in a little village. Back then it was called Bischofsteinitz. Today it's called Horsoviny-Thun. I probably mispronounced that, but anyway. So she was in what's called Bohemia. And when the Nazis annexed this area, which they refer to as Sudetendeutschland, in 1938, the Abeles family fled to Canada. And in 1942, Wilma moved to the United States, where she completed her German studies program at the University of Chicago. And this is where she also met Georg Iggers. Now, this young man, born Georg Iggersheimer, actually in Hamburg in 1926, had also fled Nazi Germany and came to America as a teenager, together with his parents in 1938. Upon arrival in New York, the parents changed the name from Iggersheimer to Iggers. And Georg later was always upset. He thought they should have stayed Iggersheimer. But the parents, of course, wanted to blend in with Americans, so they changed it to Iggers. But it's interesting, Georg always refused to adapt the spelling of his front name. He never went to George, he never added an E to his name. He was always Georg. So, and generally, and they moved from New York down to Richmond because there was a job for his father. So they moved down to Richmond, Virginia in 1939. And generally, the young Georg Iggers liked living in the United States very much. However, the racial segregation that he found there was an unexpected shock. And he said himself about this later. This was about moving to Richmond, Virginia. Oops. Oh, I'm sorry. I meant to show this slide earlier. That's family slides, so okay. So now the family had moved to Richmond, Virginia, and Georg Iggers remembers that, I did not know about racial segregation in the United States until I came to Richmond, Virginia on January 30th, 1939. He remembered the very day of when he first encountered racial segregation here in the United States. I was shocked by what I saw. It reminded me of Nazi Germany. The teenager, shocked. And because of his previous experience with racism in Germany, Iggers detested Jim Crow from the very beginning. And even as a teenager, he protested at every opportunity in school and other places against the discrimination of blacks, even though his father, again, that's the older, more careful generation, always told him, you shouldn't do this. His father's saying was always, when in Rome, do as the Romans. So if you're not supposed to sit next to a black person, you don't do that. But Georg didn't care, and he didn't change his mind about taking a stand against segregation and remained a vocal Jim Crow opponent during his studies, first at the University of Virginia and then at the University of Chicago, where he moved for his graduate studies. And it was also there, of course, where he met Wilma Abeles and fell in love, and the two got married in 1948. They had 3 sons, Daniel, Jeremy, and Jonathan. Both graduated in the same year, 1949, Wilma in German studies, Georg in history, and then they looked for work. But even in the post-war period, it was not easy for German Jewish academics to get a job as a renowned university, if you were Jewish, and especially if you were a young scholar without big, credits to your name yet. So in the summer of 1950, Georg and Wilma Iggers decided to accept an offer from Philander Smith College, a very small, historically black college in Little Rock, Arkansas. And so you can see we're going back to Arkansas now. Also, the college was only able to pay them a very low salary, and they had a huge teaching load of 18 hours per week. It was a permanent position, so that's why they moved there to the south. Wilma Iggers had actually never experienced Jim Crow before at all. Remember, she was in Canada and then in Chicago. So the first time she ever saw Jim Crow is when they moved down to Arkansas. And she remembered her first impression of this, which was kind of shocking for her. And I'll quote her here, what she told me on the phone. Black people seemed deferential and hesitant to talk to us. I remember an instance with a student of mine, pretty early on during our stay in Little Rock, when I was walking downtown, and I noticed that she kept falling behind. And I was wondering if she had some sort of handicap. So I asked her, like, can't you walk faster? What's wrong? And she said, well, she had never walked next to a white person before. Ever, You weren't supposed to walk next to a white person. And Wilma Eggers was quite shocked by this answer and was soon as determined as her husband to fight against Jim Crow. Now, of course, at the time, she took care of 3 kids. She was a working mother, so she didn't have as much time and appeared less frequently in the public than her husband. But I do want to stress that her commitment against racial segregation was just as high as his. Now, in Little Rock, not only the universities, but as I mentioned before, all public institutions were segregated, and the vast majority of the city's white citizens and the professors, because a lot of the professors at Philander Smith College were white, did not do anything about it. They kind of just accepted it. At that time, the only group of white people in the South who spoke out as firmly against segregation as they had spoken out against slavery before the Civil War were the Quakers. And some of the Eggers' best friends were among the Quakers. And together with one of them, Georg Eggers founded the Little Rock Film Society in the spring of 1953. And this small society regularly showed international movies in a hotel to a racially mixed audience, in kind of more or less open defiance of the segregation law for movie theaters. They just rented the room in the hotel and showed the movie. So it was kind of a little act of defiance. The Eggers also developed friendships with African-American families in their neighborhoods and with a number of black colleges and students from Philander Smith, which, the other white professors usually didn't. In 1953, these students invited Georg Eggers to join their fraternity, Phi Beta Sigma, and he gladly accepted, becoming the first white member of the association, and he stayed connected with them all his life. As a historian, it was, of course, also very important to Eggers that his students had access to good research literature. And he soon realized that the tiny, tiny library at Philander Smith had absolutely nothing on international relations. But he found out that the public library in Little Rock actually had quite a good selection on these books that were relevant for the topic. So he wrote a protest letter against the exclusion of his students from access to the study literature important to them, because of course the library was not open to blacks. And his letter was published by the Arkansas Gazette, and it led to intensive discussions in the Little Rock Library Council. And after long debates, the Library Council, and again overriding the protest of some of the white employees, decided, okay, well, we really need to let those students get to these books. So in the first step, they decided that the black students of Philander Smith College could use the library, and a few months later, the library was actually open to all black citizens of Little Rock, Arkansas. So the Little Rock Public Library became integrated already in 1951 of one of the first integrated libraries all over the South, and it was because of Georg Eggers' initiative. Shortly after the success, Georg and Wilma Eggers joined the local NAACP. They were the first white people elected to the NAACP board in Little Rock, and they participated in numerous activities, which I can't list here. And Georg became chair of the education department. And that's important because in this position as chair of the education department, and with support of Wilma, he did a lot of research, and he published a detailed study in the year 1952 proving that public schools for black children in Little Rock and actually in all of Arkansas received only a fraction of the public funding that white schools got. And this had been sort of common knowledge before, but he now created black on white proof for this. And the NAACP could then use this proof to sue the government, and by that they were actually able to increase the funding for black schools in Arkansas tremendously. The next step was, of course, to fight segregation, altogether. And so to achieve this, the Eggers worked closely with Daisy Bates, as I mentioned her before, throughout the Little Rock crisis. We can skip all this, how the soldiers came and everything happened, and they were very supportive of the whole activities of the NAACP during the Little Rock crisis and supported Davy Bates. By the time this conflict ended, which took 2 years, the Eggers actually didn't live in Little Rock anymore, but they did continue to support and maintain a very close personal friendship with Daisy Bates throughout their lives. And the reason why they didn't live there anymore is that in 1957, at the end of 1957, the Eggers had accepted a new teaching position. Both of them had been offered teaching positions from Dillard University, another black university in New Orleans. And Dillard was a comparatively large, especially compared to this tiny little Philander Smith College, a larger university, so they got a much better salary and a lower teaching load. And so therefore they decided to go to New Orleans. And they thought, hey, New Orleans, the Big Easy, everything's going to be great there, right? However, what they found out after they moved to New Orleans was, with their 3 young children, that race relations in the city, in New Orleans, despite its name Big Easy, were actually much more problematic and more tense than in Little Rock, Arkansas. You know, New Orleans was completely segregated. And Dillard University, you know, they had a big campus, and usually their staff lived on campus. But when the Iggers came, they couldn't offer them housing. So they said, well, why don't you, you're white, so you can, you know, just move into one of the nice apartment complexes right next to the campus. So that's what they did. They moved into a white apartment complex right next to the campus. Now, many of their neighbors, though, found out that or knew that the Iggers were teaching at a black university, and they strongly disapproved of that. They didn't want anybody in their complex who taught those, you know, the N-word. So when the Iggers once dared to invite a black colleague and his wife to their home for dinner, open hostilities ensued. Some neighbors demanded the Iggers family should immediately be thrown out of the complex. Others called them names and threatened to beat them up. The sons were teased in the school bus as, quote-unquote, nigger lovers, and a big N was painted in front of the name Iggers on the doorbell several times. So when their children were also repeatedly harassed and seriously threatened on the playground of the complex, the Iggers finally had enough. So they went back to Dillard University administration and said, you have to give us on-campus housing or we will leave. This is, you know, our children are actually at risk here. So then, you know, the administration really moved, and so they finally were able to move on campus in a small house. And of course, they were now the only white family living on the Dillard campus. But however, that experience, as Wilma told me, was very positive because they were being treated very friendly by all their African-American neighbors. And they became especially close friends with the African-American campus minister, Sam Grady. And together with Grady, the Iggers founded a racially integrated Jewish-Christian peace group that later organized demonstrations against the Vietnam War and provided counseling to conscientious objectors. The couple also became, of course, involved with the NAACP in New Orleans. Georg Iggers, again, was elected chairman of the Education Committee, and they did a lot of work to integrate schools in Little Rock. I'm going to leave out the details here, but it actually was harder than in Little Rock. It took longer. It was not until November of 1960 that the first black children in New Orleans were able to attend a previously all-white primary school, and here again, the students had to be accompanied by white U.S. Marshals to protect them from violent white segregationists. So the Big Easy was really not that easy. George and Wilma Iggers also participated in numerous other protests against Jim Crow in the following years. And again, for time reason, I will leave this out. Let me just mention one thing. Georg Iggers became the only white man in New Orleans to be accepted in an exclusive association of African-American leaders. They had an organization called Frontier of America. It was like all the most important, you know, cultural, economic, and political leaders of New Orleans, all black. And Georg Iggers was invited to join. And this group met in 1962 with a representative of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, you know, who came to New Orleans and wanted to talk to people about race relations there. So he's meeting this group, and he is completely astonished to see a white man in the group. And the president of the Frontier of America introduced Georg with the words, "Iggers is really black. He just happens to have white skin." I thought that was a great quote. Now, in addition to his courses at Dillard University, I briefly want to mention that Georg also taught one class every summer at the Tulane University. Tulane University is, of course, you know, this beautiful white university, you know, had all the funding, and they had a huge library, which is basically why Georg did that, because he wanted to have access to the library. And if you were an adjunct professor, you could use the library. However, what he noticed that most of the other Tulane historians at the time were actually avid segregationists. Some were really outright racist, and they provided their students with American historiography that whitewashed slavery and justified Jim Crow. And so Georg Iggers deliberately placed new progressive texts on the curriculum of his classes, including those by black civil rights activists such as W.E.B. Du Bois and Martin Luther King Jr. And it goes without saying that that, of course, did not make him very popular among the white colleagues or the administration of Tulane University. This is why he said they would have never hired me, never. So in June of 1964, though, as you know, the proponents of racial equality scored a huge victory with the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 64, which was signed. And that really, this law finally declared all forms of discrimination based on race, color, religion, gender, or national origin illegal in all areas of public life and in the workplace. So the Civil Rights Act of 1964 really effectively ended the era of racial segregation in the United States. I mean, the politics took a bit more, that's why I took this, the Voting Rights Act of 65, but the Civil Rights Act was very, very important. And a few months later, Georg Iggers received a very attractive job offer from the State University of New York at Buffalo, which included a doubling of his salary and again, less teaching load. So the couple therefore decided to move to New York, not least for financial reasons. But Georg also stressed another reason for the move, and I quote him here, "Now that the legal barriers to the abolition of segregation had been abolished, different strategies were needed in the North as well as in the South. Now it was a matter of addressing social and economic discrimination and the problem of continuing de facto separation, which was much harder to find." And I think it's amazing that Georg Iggers already back then really understood the core essence of the severe problems to Black equality or African American equality that continue to exist until today. Because despite significant progress, we all know race relations in America are still in many areas, just think of police violence or Black Lives Matters, as tense today as they were 50 years ago. And as you all know, there are still significant differences in many areas of the socioeconomic situations, comparing white and Black Americans to this day. And both Wilma and Georg Iggers were often very disappointed about the slow progress after 1965. But they never gave up their struggle for racial and social justice and remained active members of the NAACP and the peace movement throughout their lives. As Georg wrote at the end of the autobiography that he and Wilma published together in 2006, "I have never believed that progress was inevitable, but I'm still convinced that we must strive, even if by small steps, for conditions in which all human beings can live in dignity." From the late 1960s onward, the Iggers also started to spend time in Germany again on a regular basis. They eventually became quite involved in the academic and also a little bit in the political life of Germany. And I don't have time to elaborate on this here, but what's really important is that Georg Iggers became a very important bridge builder between German and American historians, and also very important, a bridge builder between East German and West German historians. And he also became very, very accomplished in German historiography. His groundbreaking work, The German Conception of History, is still up to this day regarded as the classic text of critique of historicism. And I will skip some of this here. Just want to let me mention that in the end, now in the 21st century, Georg in particular, but also Wilma Iggers, both received a number of awards for their academic achievements and their commitment for racial and social justice, and also for German Jewish and German Czech reconciliation. In 2004, for example, Wilma was awarded the Grazi's Agit Prize of the Czech government, and Georg Iggers received the German Federal Cross of Merit First Class, which is like the highest civilian honor you can get in Germany, in 2007. So Georg Iggers unfortunately died last year, November 26, very shortly before his 91st birthday. But Wilma Iggers is still living in Buffalo, New York today. So if you happen to be in Buffalo, you can go visit her. She's a wonderful lady. And the example of their fearless advocacy for the equality and dignity of all people that both of the Iggers set continues to be an inspiration, in my view, to this day. Throughout their teaching, writings, and actions, both have positively touched and changed the lives of many people on both sides of the Atlantic. So looking at all of those four protagonists that I have introduced to you here, the special significance of the history of the Iggers, Viktor Löwenfeld and Friedrich Friedmann, as well as all the other German Jewish refugee scholars in the south of the United States that I could not mention today, is that their presence there resulted in a highly unusual cultural exchange process between people of completely different origin. And this process had transformative effects for both sides and opened up new possibilities for cooperation across traditional boundaries of race nation, and religion. So in conclusion, let me just offer 4 brief observations. Number 1, all Jews who fled from the Nazis and taught in the United States, at least all that I came across in my research, condemned the Jim Crow system and tried to resist it in different ways. Probably their own experience with the terrible consequences of state-authorized racism simply made it impossible for them to accept the discrimination of African Americans practiced in the US South. Their efforts to resist the system were not always successful, and because of their convictions, they had to deal with some serious professional disadvantages and personal difficulties. However, their commitment undoubtedly, or at least I'm convinced of that, contributed to the destabilization of the Jim Crow order. Second, the first-generation refugees who experienced Nazi terror as an adult and lost their parents or most of their family in the Holocaust were rather cautious in their resistance against Jim Crow and focused primarily on teaching humanist values and promoting their African American students as much as possible. Whereas refugees of the second generation, who had already come to North America as young people and were mainly socialized here, so that's true for the first generation would be Viktor Löwenfeld and Friedrich Friedmann, and the second generation would be the Iggers, who both came to the United States as young people. And they were much more willing to openly speak out against Jim Crow and be active participants in protest measures. They were not as afraid of the police, okay? They sort of considered themselves more of American citizens and less as refugees in the first generation. Third, the encounters between German Jewish professors and their families with African Americans in the South, despite some initial hesitations and distrust, led to more understanding between both groups and numerous personal friendships. And it is my opinion that in the long run, this actually also contributed to a certain increase in collaboration and an improvement of relations between people of Jewish and African descent in the United States. And fourth and last, the experience gained in the struggle against Jim Crow apparently motivated and also enabled a number of these German Jewish refugee scholars who later returned to Germany to distinguish themselves as successful mediators between various religious, ethnic, and national groups. Now, of course, the life histories presented here were not without their ambivalences and problems. You know, these are not all like totally happy, successful life stories. For example, all of the scholars I talked about eventually moved more or less voluntarily to the north of the United States or returned to Germany. One of the examples, by the way, to the contrary, is a scholar, the sociologist Ernst Borinski. He also fled Nazi Germany in 1938, accepted a teaching position at Tougaloo College in Mississippi in 1947, and actually stayed and taught there until his death in 1983, I'm sorry. So some stayed, but none of the people I chose, and I chose them because they all showed very different ways of reacting to the system. So, but regardless whether they stayed permanently or only for a number of years, the presence of German Jewish refugee scholars in the south of the United States, in my view, left positive traces on both sides of the Atlantic. The life and work of these people is thus an excellent example of Histoire Croisée, entangled history, revealing the transnational impact of personal experiences, as well as the inherently interactive development of political, social, and religious history within the transatlantic cultural sphere of the 20th century. And with that, I would like to thank you all for your patience and for your attention. Thank you very much. Okay. And I can't see my watch. I hope I didn't talk too long. So
thank you. No, that's here. Let's sit down. So thank you so much for that. Questions? You have some time for a Q&A?
yeah, of course, absolutely. Any questions or comments or additions? Steve, yes.
I think it's a little bit misleading whatever Professor Iggers mentioned to you. Tulane was not quite as segregationist in the early 60s as I think he said. I was an undergraduate there. I took a course with Iggers on European history, 20th century.
Okay.
Not in the summer, but during the semester. And whatever you could say about the Americanists there were two Europeanists, John Snell and Hans Schmidt. Schmidt was from Frankfurt, who were his friends, and certainly in no way defenders of segregation.
Yeah.
I guess my deeper question, Britta, is did any of these four people, as a result of the experiences in Germany and in the South, reflect upon or in any way deepen or cultivate their own Jewishness?
That's a good question. I know that the Iggers were not, like, none of them were like Orthodox actively involved, but they did attend synagogues. I know that the Iggers also had a good contact with a rabbi, but they were not like super really Jewishly involved. They did raise their kids Jewish, they had bar mitzvahs and everything, but it's a good question. We should ask Wilma about that. She's the only one still alive, and she's in her late 90s now, but I actually did not ask that. That's a very good point. Thank you for bringing that up. Yeah. Yes.
I actually had a related thought about that, and just, I mean, I think you've answered it, but just the people you profiled worked as individuals, again, and on their own convictions, but I was also wondering if there was any, if they did seek out any Jewish community, or if there, if there were larger communities that were doing this, but also connected to that, it's well known that, or talked about a lot, that there were a lot of Jews involved in the civil rights movement and,
Yes.
in Mississippi and
Oh,
Freedom
yeah.
Summer in particular. So have you come across any connections between this group, maybe the children of these groups, and those civil rights workers?
Not any direct connection. I think it is really no coincidence that there were the large, I would say almost the majority, for example, of those students who went down during the Mississippi Freedom Summer were Jewish, because, Michael Schorner and Annie Goodman, those two of the three that got killed together with James Chaney in the summer of '64 in Mississippi. I think it's the feeling of being persecuted because of and I think for most of them it was not because of their race. Because the way the Nazis treated Judaism was not as a religion, because they put a lot of Jews into the concentration camps that were Christians, had converted. For example, what's her name, this famous... Edith Stein, thank you. Edith Stein in Münster, where I went to undergraduate school. I lived in the Edith Stein, they have a student housing thing named after her, and she was a Christian. But they didn't care. For them, Judaism was a thing. Religion was not the important, it was the racism. People were not persecuted because of their belief. They were persecuted because they were seen as a different race. That's the whole thing about a biological threat. And I think that's why there was such a strong connection between these activists and African Americans, because they felt this is racism. Not so much religious persecution in the sense of, that you had, why a lot of other people fled to America because they were persecuted for their religion, not because of their race, like the Baptists or the Hutterites or the Amish, or these people were persecuted for their belief. Jews were persecuted because they were seen as a racial group. I don't know if that answers your questions. Yes, Werner.
Wonderful topic and good talk. I have a couple of questions and then some footnotes. The first question is, did you do a quantitative tally too of how many cases did you find of Jewish emigres who taught in historically black colleges in the South in the period during the war and after the war?
Well,
is there sort of a register from which you chose the cases?
Well, the only sort of register, the person who really went and looked at all the archives was Gabrielle Edgecombe, and she comes up with this figure of like 50 or so, and I think there were about 10 more. And but I also looked at, like, Friedrich Friedman was somebody I came across. I didn't even know about him when I was in Augsburg, and somebody told me, oh, by the way, do you know that Friedman was in the South? I said, no, I had no idea. Do you know his daughter came back to Germany and lives there? So that's how I found out about it. I think there is much more research to be done in this area to really, and I don't have the resources to do that because I think you'd really have to live here and go to all these colleges and look through all their archives and see who was actually there. But a ballpoint figure is probably that there were about 50 to 60 scholars who spent at least a few years teaching in the South.
So the second question is integrationist activities within the profession. You know, at a time when the MLA didn't admit any black professors, the College Language Association was in fact integrated. So the question is, did they participate in the scholarly associations that were associations for blacks and whites in the period, or did they go to the conventions that everybody, or did they not go to any conventions because they were marginalized in the? That might be another way to look at it socially.
Well, when did these conventions start, though? I don't think they didn't start until the 50s, right? Or later 50s.
I think the College Language goes back longer than that.
I don't know of any of the scholars I looked at their writings. They never talked about attending any of these conventions, and I don't think they were members. I know Friedrich Friedman wasn't for sure because he was not a member of any professional organization when he refused to sign the affidavit. So if he had been a member of the MLA, that would have come up in the documentation. So
just a footnote, Tom Cripps gave a whole series of lectures here maybe 20 years ago, and he always said this is a great topic. He taught at Morgan State all his life, and he said, you know, like half the faculty, there's like, you know, the informal network of people who knew each other, and somebody should really pick up he was thinking more generally, the German refugees teaching at Southern black colleges. And there's my other footnote too, that Jeffrey Mailman worked on the French refugees from World War II, and they were furious because the Germans made them lose their jobs in France. Then they went to New York, and every job was taken by a German Jewish refugee. So they said, once again, you know, we're ousted by the German invasion. So there were quite a few institutions in New York, like the New School, you know, founded directly to help refugees that accommodated them as well. So
and there were a lot of help organizations like the Council on German Jewish Refugees and stuff that helped out. That is absolutely true and important. Yes.
So the Frankfurt School people, I think they were not permitted to teach at Columbia. Columbia gave them a room, but Butler didn't want to have anything to do with the actual teaching of that crowd, you know. So,
and there has been actually quite a lot of research done, among others, by Andreas Daum and others who published books on sort of the second generation but it's mostly about their scholarly work, and 90% of the scholars they talk about, it's all about Fritz Stern and these people who were here very well connected in the North. But there, for some reason, there's just been very, very little research, or practically none other publications except the Edgecombe book that I know, book publication, on this role of white Jewish scholars in the South, or German Jewish refugee scholars in the South. So, thank you. Yes? I think the microphone is coming to you from both sides now.
Hi. I want to thank you for this talk. I've learned a lot. I've lived in Germany for 10 years, and I've had numerous conversations with...
who is asking a question? Can you... Thank you. I'm sorry. We couldn't...
Where did you live in Germany?
In Cologne.
Oh, nice.
Ja, genau. Ich habe 10 Jahre in Köln gelebt.
Und fließend Deutsch sprechen, das ist super.
Es ist kein akademisches Deutsch, aber man versteht Hauptsache. But I wanted to say that I've had numerous conversations with German scholars, and this is the first time that I've been, you know, that I've had, like, sat in a lecture or even had this conversation to be informed. So I'm grateful just to be here and to learn.
Thank you.
My question is basically, I mean, you've provided a few examples where the refugee, like these scholars would talk about their views on humanism, or if you provided comments from African American students who had talked about how they were impacted by, you know, this, as they, you know, whatever they learned from these scholars. Our culture, our African American culture is so beautiful and so rich.
Yes.
I'm interested in knowing if you have any, like if you could share with us the ways in which they may have learned, what they may have learned from us, or if they had, you know, different ways of navigating their own humanity in the midst,
Yeah.
if that makes sense.
No, it certainly does. And I mean, I'm actually not a specialist, and this topic is not really my total area of expertise. I haven't done a lot of research in it yet. But in the few there, unfortunately, Löwenfeld didn't leave a diary or anything. So there were only a few articles and interviews that I could pull from. But I had the feeling that the friendship and sort of also seeing and experiencing this incredible art that his students did. And I mean, you saw some of these incredible, and you can go online. I mean, the pictures, and this doesn't do justice to it. But they are so incredible. And I think it totally inspired him. And the friendship and seeing how people in these really horrible, oppressive conditions persevered really gave him courage to go on, because he was absolutely devastated. His plan had kind of been to return to Germany and reunite with his family, and then he found out, he did this request, and it took many, many, many months for this committee to get back to him, and every single person was dead. And he may have just despaired if it hadn't been for that supportive community, and not just the personal friendship, but also the incredible artistic capabilities and this whole new, visual, art that he experienced, that he got back from his students. So I think it was really a mutual inspirational process that took place in the limited way, and I'm not an art historian, that I could see that. So I don't know if that helps a little bit. Yes. Other questions? Any other questions or comments?
If I have one more, if there's no one else. So you said you're not a specialist in this
No, I'm not.
area, but so what, is this a part of a bigger project, or what, or is it kind of isolated that these are
Yeah.
materials that you found that you wanted to write about, but you're not going further with them?
It actually is something that I would love to go in and research deeper, but because I was sort of in between, I was also in between jobs, going back from DC to the Augsburg University, and there, because of the denomination of my chair, when you do an inaugural lecture, you have to, supposedly to do a lecture that really kind of shows how important this very new chair is in the denomination of transatlantic history. And I had read this Edgecombe book and had really become very fascinated, and I co-organized a conference on African American Jewish collaboration in the area of education, which also included the Rosenwald schools and other things. And we did a conference at Howard University that I was co-organizer in 2016. And so the topic was kind of really something I wanted to deal with, and that's why I prepared this lecture. But it's not, I'm currently working on another book about the Children Defense Fund, totally different topic. And so in order to really dig more into this, you would have to really spend, in my view, substantial amounts of times here in the United States, traveling to all these universities and, talking to surviving students who are there. And I was just very, very happy I was able to still talk to the Iggers who were alive via, video conferences and things, and that I met Miriam Friedman. But as I said, right now it's kind of beyond my capabilities to delve deeper into this. So any one of you who's interested in, it's a topic that needs to be researched. And I think a lot of people can contribute to that story, exploring that story. I think it's a story that needs to be told and explored because it's important.
Yeah, and from different directions
Yes,
too.
yes.
Yeah, so, well, thank you so, do you have a question, Alexandra? Go ahead, I'm sorry, I didn't
So
see
maybe
you
there's
before.
a DFG Antrag or something like that, and there may be
yeah.
plenty of student researchers to do that in travel states for you. Thank you so much. That was really interesting. Makes so much so much sense for me. Also, sort of the way their own experiences feed into their struggle against racism in the South. I was just wondering, and that kind of ties in, I think, with some of the questions that were asked earlier. How much did did any of those scholars, were they in touch with professors in the North, like Jewish professors, German Jewish professors? Did you come across anything like that, or were they really isolated, sort of, at the universities they were working at? Sort of, did they talk to people in New York and that kind of stuff, or were they really sort of in their secluded southern area in Australia?
No, some of them had friendships with other professors, and not just Jewish, but just generally other professors in the north. And for example, Ernst Borinsky taught, I think, at some university in New York every summer, but then he returned and spent the rest of the year in Tougaloo, Mississippi. And so they weren't completely isolated, but they weren't able to secure a job. But that's, of course, also the reality of it. As much as some were committed to being there, you know, if you have three kids and somebody offers you a job where you get twice the salary and less of a teaching load, then all your enthusiasm maybe of saying, I want to be here and I want to support that little black college, you know, in some cases, and that's why I'm saying it's not just all a story of, you know, self-sacrifice and incredible philanthropy from everybody. People also had to make a living and survive. And they did, but they did cultivate stuff. And one of the reasons really Georg Iggers was so happy about going to Buffalo is again, because of the libraries there. Wilma told me the thing he really suffered from, that in the South, most of the universities that he had access to, with the exception of Tulane then eventually, did not have the kind of access to research literature and also this kind of international environment. In the northern universities, you had a lot of scholars coming from Europe, and you could just sort of network much better than in the South. And some people were bothered more by this than others. As I said, Borinsky was not bothered by that at all.
How did Friedman know Hannah Arendt?
I don't know how and when they met. Maybe that I don't know is the answer to that question. I just know that she came to visit them and they talked, and that he said that she was the one, Miriam told me that it was because of Hannah Arendt's advice, because they were kind of dead set against ever setting foot to Germany again before. And when Hannah Arendt said, you just move forward, try it out, and if you really feel this is more than you can handle, you can always come back. And then they stayed. And I think it's particularly neat that he became such good friends with the, now where do I have the thingy? There we go. Yeah, Abt Odino Lechner, because he is really he's a very accomplished scholar too. He wasn't just a monk, but he has published a lot of books on humanism and is really a very special person. And then again, it's so funny how small the world is, because Abt Odilo baptized my oldest daughter. So it's funny how it all comes together. He's dead now too. But but I thought it was really amazing for this, somebody whose parents had been killed by the Jews, by Christians, is able to develop a really close friendship with this Benedictine abbot.
In the periodicals room that serves beer.
Actually, I'm not sure if it's beer, it's the glasses, but I'm thinking Friedman is drinking water and Abt Odilo is drinking apple juice or something there. I don't think it's beer. It looks like the beer glass. But they allow drinks in there anyway. Okay, any other questions? No? Yes? Microphone is coming your way again.
I was wondering,
Can you move it a bit?
I don't know if this even fits, but I wonder how they negotiate, these identities that seem to be in conflict as they are determined by this outside environment. For example, being German and Jewish and now white, and what does that mean? And then, and I can relate to when I ask myself, what does it mean to be African and African American and American in an environment in the American context that's very hostile to my being. I wonder what those conversations were like from both sides, if we were to just sort of eavesdrop.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I wonder if you could speak to that, maybe.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, I wasn't sort of part of these conversations they had, but I think, in general, I think one thing that really moved me was Löwenthal's commentary that he felt that the everyday life of African Americans, and I think it's not that different today in some areas, this constant idea that you may be attacked because of the color of your skin, that this is a terror that he related to, that reminded him of how he felt when the Nazis were in Austria, in Vienna, in his home. And he said, I felt paralyzed. I couldn't think of anything. I could not be creative because it's so oppressive. And he made that connection to what it means to be Black in America. But, the story gets even more complicated when you think about, I have some Afro-German friends. And, it gets even more complicated because here in America, at least you could say, people will not question that you're American. Okay, my Afro-German friends have the constant problem that, they're born, a lot of them have, either African or African-American fathers and the mothers are German. And so they have grown up in Germany, they speak German, that's their mother tongue, they're completely German. But whenever anybody looks at them on the street, they think they're not German. Because in the German mindset, it's still so ingrained that people who are German are supposed to be white. Very simple. If you're Asian looking, if you're African looking, you cannot possibly be German. And so the question they always get is, oh, Sie sprechen aber gut Deutsch. Yeah? And it drives people up the wall. And so these issues are just so complicated and complex. And unfortunately, I think it's going to take Germany at least another 2 or 3 generations for a majority of the population to accept a multicultural society and to not question somebody's Germanness based on the color of their skin. And then, of course, it's scary with all this new developments, as you all know. Ugly right-wing populism is not only up and running here in America. We have the AfD, the Alternative for Germany in Germany has now sitting in every parliament of the countries, which would be like the state units in Germany, and they are completely racist. They don't say they are racist, but they are. And it's scary. It scares me that these people are now actually voted into parliament. So, but as Georg Igger says, one can never give up. You have to step by step, not be discouraged, and keep going and just hope. In that sense, I'm sort of a big believer in what Martin Luther King always says. He said, the arc of the universe is long, but it's then bent towards justice. So in the end, hopefully, things will get better.
Let's hope.
Okay. That's all. So on that happy note.
So thank you very much. Please join us out there for a reception.
Thank you for the great questions. Thank you. Okay. Aber gerne. Vielen Dank für die tollen Fragen.